Lesson 97, Formal and Informal Speech. When I first learned and understood the way that formal and informal speech are handled in the Spanish language, I thought to myself, wow, that's really unique to the Spanish language. We don't have anything like that in English. And I thought to myself, well, this is very foreign to me, so I'll just have to keep working at this and work at it and memorize it until it feels natural. Then in the course of writing this book, I was thinking more about the concept of formal and informal speech in Spanish. You know, when you're writing a book, you have to understand the subject matter enough not only to know it for yourself, but to be able to explain it to someone else. So in the course of writing this book, I was trying to understand formal and informal speech more deeply, attain a deeper understanding of it. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize that we actually do have a parallel to this in English. And if you'll permit me, I'll try to explain this in a way that seems to make sense to me, and perhaps this will help you as well. Now, a long time ago, near the beginning of the book, we learned about person, that is, first person, second person, and third person, and how these work together to form sentences. We know that first person is the person doing the talking, second person is the person you're talking to, and third person is the person or people that you're talking about. And I think by this stage in the book, you probably have a pretty good grasp on all these different concepts. That's why we delayed formal and informal speech until so late in the book, is so that you could get a good grasp on the issue of person before tackling informal and formal speech. Because the issue of formal and informal speech really revolves around person. Mainly, we're going to be using second person and third person, and we're going to be studying different ways to use second and third person to achieve a sense of informality or a sense of a more formal style of speech. As part of our explanation of formal and informal speech, we have an imaginary situation. It's taking place in England, in the palace of the Queen, and the scene here is in the kitchen. Here in the kitchen, the butler is taking a break. And he's, like any good Englishman, he's going to drink some tea. And the cook is there too. And so they're sitting there taking a break together. Of course, since they work together, the butler and the cook are friends. The butler looks over and notices his friend, the cook, drinking coffee and thinks that's strange because the cook usually drinks tea. And he says to his friend, the cook, "You usually drink tea." Okay? Now when he does this, he speaks directly to his friend, the cook, using the second person. We have a sentence here, you usually drink tea. The word you is the subject, and drink is the verb. And so you drink is in the second person singular. So just take note of that as we continue our discussion. Then as our imaginary story continues, later on, the butler is in the presence of the Queen, and the Queen asks for some coffee as well. Well, the British typically drink tea, and so the butler is surprised, and he says to the Queen, "Your Majesty usually drinks tea." Okay, here's the whole point of this story. The point is that the content of what the butler is saying is the same with regard to the cook and the Queen. He's saying basically the same thing. He's expressing his surprise that they're drinking coffee, and he's pointing out that usually they drink tea. But the way he says it to the butler and the way he says it to the Queen are different. Let's take a look at how he says it to the Queen. When he says it to the Queen, here's how he words it. He says, "Your Majesty usually drinks tea." Okay, the subject of the sentence here is the word majesty, and the verb is drinks. What we have here is a third-person construction. Majesty and drinks is in the third person. The word your is an adjective, Let's contrast that with what the butler said to the cook. He said to the cook, "You usually drink tea." That was in the second person. Now you may be thinking to yourself, why would the butler speak to the cook in the second person, but speak to the queen in the third person? Well, here is how I would explain it. I would say that when you speak to someone in the second person, it assumes a certain quality of closeness or familiarity with that person. The butler and the cook are friends, so they have a personal relationship. So the butler felt comfortable with his friend and spoke to him in the second person and just said, "You usually drink tea." Now for the queen, that kind of closeness or familiarity might not be proper. For someone of the queen's high rank or high position, the butler might want to use terminology or language that is less cozy with her, less familiar. In other words, he might want to leave a little bit of distance between himself and the queen. And one way to achieve that sense of distance is to use the third person. So instead of saying to the queen the word "you" and addressing her directly, he calls her by her title, Your Majesty. And of course, if you said Your Majesty, you would need a third person verb along with that. Let's take a look at what would happen if we used a second person verb with Your Majesty. That would say, Your Majesty usually drink tea. Well, that doesn't make sense, because in that sentence, the subject and the verb don't agree. So really, when you say, Your Majesty drinks tea, that's a third-person sentence. You're speaking in the third person. So by addressing the queen in this way, the butler is able to have a little bit of a sense of professional distance from her. He's not quite so familiar with her, not quite so cozy with her. Okay, so here's the point of this lesson, is that we can use the third person as a way to speak to someone in a formal way. We can use a title of respect and a third person verb, and we can basically speak to them in the third person. And that's going to leave a little bit of distance between us. It's going to be more formal and with less of a sense of familiarity and closeness. Let's practice this a little bit with our exercises. Let's see if we can get the subject and the verb to agree with each other. And let's think about if we're using second person or third person. In number 1, we have Your Majesty have or has a cup of tea already. Okay, let's figure out which verb will agree with Your Majesty. Well, have is a second person verb. You could say you have, but has is third person. We could say he has, she has, or it has. And the basic construction of this sentence is third person. It's a formal type of statement. Your Majesty, well, obviously we're talking to the Queen. Obviously it's a formal type of statement. So the correct choice here is has. That's the third person verb that's going to agree with Your Majesty. So the correct answer is Your Majesty has a cup of tea already. In exercise number 2, it's as though we're speaking to a judge, another person in a position of high honor or high rank. So again, we're going to say something in a formal sense. The sentence is, Your Honor are or is welcome to see the document. The verb here, are, is second person, and the verb is third person. The basic construction of this sentence is a formal statement. It's a third person statement. So we need to use the third person verb is. So the correct answer is, Your Honor is welcome to see the document. If we used the verb are, it just would not agree because that's a second person verb trying to fit into a third person type of statement. If we said, Your Honor are welcome to see the document, that wouldn't make any sense. So the correct answer here is. In number 3, another formal statement to a person of high rank. Your Excellency go or goes to meetings every day. Again, the basic construction of this is a formal statement using a special title of respect, and it's using the third person. So we need a third person verb. Go is second person, and goes is third person. So we need to choose the verb goes, and the sentence will say, Your Excellency goes to meetings every day. If we used the word go, that would not agree with the subject of the sentence. That would say, Your Excellency go to meetings every day. That doesn't make any sense. So the correct answer here is goes. In number 4, we have a question. Have or has Your Honor heard enough testimony? Well, this is the type of question you might hear in a courtroom, something said to a judge. It's constructed in the third person, so we need a third person verb. Have is second person, and has is third person. So if we said, has Your Honor heard enough testimony, that would sound good. That would be correct. If we used the second person verb have, then that wouldn't make any sense. It would say, have Your Honor heard enough testimony? So the correct choice here is has. In number 5, we're speaking to the Queen again. Your Majesty usually prefer or prefers Earl Grey tea. The verb prefer is second person. We could say you prefer, and the verb prefers is third person. We could say he, she, or it prefers. Again, this is a formal statement. It's in the third person, so we need a third person verb. So we'll choose prefers, and the sentence will say, Your Majesty usually prefers Earl Grey tea. So here, the correct choice is prefers.